A close look at this structure. 11 million square feet. But almost immediately we have difficulty renting the space. It took years to approach full occupancy with undesirable office space, gun-slit windows, low ceilings. It was subsidized financially, finally, by the tenancy of Governor Rockefeller, who put his entire state offices in there of 20,000 employees. The building was a disaster financially in the first decade. They had difficulties renting it, and it required numerous renovations in the first decade as well. $200 million for asbestos removal, which became a hot issue almost immediately upon its construction. $800 million for rebuilding electrical communications and cooling systems, and galvanic corrosion was endemic, eating away at the connection between the structural steel and the aluminum cladding around the outside. The Port Authority denied permits for controlled demolition on several occasions due to the asbestos content, which would have been released into the atmosphere. Were they going to tear it down and rebuild it? It would have cost $5.6 billion to take it down to its structure with the scaffolding, somewhere up to $15 billion, some say. They were basically condemned structures. Nevertheless, 3 months prior to 9/11, we have a transfer of ownership with a 99-year lease to Larry Silverstein, transferring all of this real estate to him and his partners for $3.2 billion. Larry, I believe it's now $125 million of his own money he invested. And why would he do this if it was going to take $5.6 billion to $15 billion to repair it? Did he have some knowledge that he was going to be assisted in his demolition effort? The lease he signed had an all-important escape clause. If the buildings are struck by an act of terrorism, the new owner's obligations under the lease are void. This is extremely unusual, I am told. I'm not an expert in leases. Maybe some of you are. As a result, the owners are not required to make any payments under their lease, will be able to collect the insurance, and indeed Silverstein is on his way to collecting $7 billion. He's got 4.6 already. The insurance companies made out as well. You might feel sorry for them under the circumstances. They raised their premiums over 2,000%. They came out smelling like a rose. In its place, the Freedom Tower is scheduled to rise to 1,776 square feet and will be a major profit center for Larry and the Port Authority as well. The Twin Towers were very unique at the time, with a dense grid of up to this time, these buildings had a dense grid of steel, as you can see, and or concrete frames all the way through the building, every 30 feet or so. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with this very strong, dense mesh of steel surrounding the exterior, acting as a bearing wall and to resist all the lateral forces. Inside was the core, a dense grid of 47 immense steel box columns, 4-inch thick at the base and 2-inch thick at mid-height, narrowing to a 1/4-inch thick at the height at the top. Prefabricated floor assemblies with 20-gauge steel deck over 29-inch deep steel web joists were topped with 4 inches of reinforced concrete, all of which was completely pulverized on 9/11. We'll be looking for evidence of these 110 pancakes at the bottom of the Twin Towers. The trusses were welded and bolted to the beams at the core and also at the spandrel panels at the perimeter bearing wall. So these were solidly constructed buildings. They were not designed to pancake, as you may have heard ludicrously mentioned by some, with 47 steel core columns and 240 perimeter columns. The perimeter structure was over-designed with a ratio of 20:1 because this was a new structure and they weren't taking any chances. The steel frame is a 100,000-ton heat sink. Any 1400 degree fire, as was alleged, or 1800 degree in some cases, alleged to have occurred near the core columns, would have been absorbed and dissipated through this incredible heat sink. But as we'll see, temperatures of such, there's no evidence for these temperatures whatsoever, even so. So you can see at the base, this incredible core column is almost solid steel. And they're rising up, 47 of them here. And these are the metal decks and the perimeter columns with the spandrel panels. All capped by a hat truss, which serves to tie the perimeter and the core columns together, as well as support the massive concrete antenna, which was 300 feet high. Let's take a look and see what the imperative was for jetliner proofing the building.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, the towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
The airplane we were envisioning was the largest airplane of its time, flying slowly and low, lost in the fog. We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
The Boeing 707, by the way, has a kinetic energy equal to that of the 767, which hit the Twin Towers on 9/11, because the 707 flies much faster, 500 miles per hour versus 400 for the 767. I believe those figures are correct. So you can look at that calculation on Jim Hoffman's site, 911research.com. So what does John Skilling say? The World Trade Center structural engineer over Leslie Robertson. The biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building. And if that happened, there'd be a fire. So this was taken into account by the words from John Skilling's mouth himself. Now, both FEMA and NIST acknowledged that the impacts virtually did nothing to the structural integrity of the building. They stood for 56 minutes and 102 minutes, respectively, after their initial impacts. And the building swayed, they came to a stop, the forces were routed around the impact, and FEMA, of course, says, well, what happened was the fireproofing was knocked off. That made the steel vulnerable to the intense fires. We'll be taking a look at that allegation. Let's look at the drawings that we get from PBS NOVA and FEMA. Quite deceptive illustrations. In this case, we see a bunch of pancakes stacked up ready to fall down with no core columns. There's this effort to deny that there was a core in these buildings by the 9/11 Commission itself, which said the core was a hollow steel shaft, by these, which really trying to sell something to the American people. Reminds me of some of the mortgage advertisements I get in my mail with these low interest rates and low payments. It's a total deception. In the case of the trusses, they're not shown with their cross bridging. They're not shown with the steel decking, which is topped with 4 inches of concrete, all of which goes to support it. We don't see a core in the case of this drawing until you read the fine print and realize that, oh yeah, one's a core column and one's a perimeter column, and we're talking about the span between them.